Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's message. I'm Eric, the lead pastor of South Mountain Community Church. Thank you for taking just a bit of your time to be with us today. We exist for one reason, and that's to help as many people as possible take their next step towards becoming fully devoted and fully delighted followers of Jesus Christ. And I know that for so many people, church and even religion can be messy and oh so complicated, but it doesn't have to be that way. Here you can belong before you believe. So our hope is that your first visit with us is enjoyable, meaningful, and unlike the church experiences of your past. We also think that the best way to experience delight is with others in person. So SMCC is about more than just a Sunday sermon. We have 5 locations for you to choose from where you can connect with people in authentic community. We want every message you hear to engage your head, your heart, and your hands for a life of full delight. So with all of that in mind, enjoy today's message.
Your seats. If you're coming in just a little bit late, I'm Eric, get to serve as one of the pastors here. And this is the moment in our service where we pause for about 30 minutes or so and reflect on something that I think will be helpful and hopeful for you regardless of what you believe. Now, one of the things that I appreciate, one of the things I enjoy and am fascinated by are the changes that happen inside of cultures. And the changes that happen inside of our culture, because when culture changes, it impacts us whether we know it or not. And sometimes things come along and they leave an impact on our culture, and therefore they impact us. And some of those things leave a lasting mark. And one of the things that's come along in the last decade or so that has really impacted our culture is something called Netflix. Netflix, I'm convinced, has changed entertainment culture. It has changed our culture. It's changed how we consume. Raise your hand if you have a Netflix account. I'm just curious. Raise your hand if you have Netflix. Awesome, hands down. Raise your hand if you're stealing that Netflix from somebody else. This is church. We can pray for you. Come forward. I'm in my mid-30s now. I am now paying for my mom's Netflix. I just want to give back. Isn't that nice of me? Netflix has changed. It was her birthday present. I said, Mom, for the whole year, I'm going to buy you your Netflix. She was thrilled. Except my kids would watch, and we only had the 1-screen version of Netflix, and so I upped it for Mother's Day. We have the 2-screen version now, so she can watch Netflix along with my kids, 1,000 miles away. Netflix has changed how we consume and how we go about entertainment. I mean, there was once a day where Netflix began sending DVDs to your mailbox. How ancient, How ancient is that? I mean, that's like the dinosaurs did that. But that's how Netflix began. And now Netflix has so impacted our culture that there's this word, this hyphenated word that we use to describe the impact Netflix has made on us. It's called binge watching. Binge watching. And you know about this. You probably have done this. The word binge means hyper engagement in an activity for a short season or period of time. And there are times where I'll spend a week watching Netflix, going through a show. We're actually on Hulu right now watching Welcome to Wrexham. I don't know if you've watched that show, but we've been binging that, Carissa and I. And then I'll go 3 months without watching Netflix at all. This is the nature of a binge. And this is good at times because you can go at your own pace. But sometimes it's unhealthy because that pace isn't healthy and that pace isn't sustainable. Now, I think there is a connection between the on-demand binge nature we find in our culture and Christianity. So I made up a word that I want to share with you. I made it up a while back. When you take binge culture and you add to it Christianity, the sum total of those 2 parts is a word I made up. We'll put it up on the screen. It's the word bingianity. I know, as that's a weird word. Bingianity is hyper engagement with Christianity for a short period of time. And like I did earlier with that Greek word presbyteros, this isn't as meaningful and as important, but let's say bingianity together so I know you know what we're talking about this morning. Bingianity on 3. 1, 2, 3. Bingianity, yeah, hyper engagement with Christianity for a short period of time. And bingianity really reflects a consumer mindset. It represents an entertainment mindset, and it represents this is all about me and what I can get out of this type of mindset. And we binge something, anything for a while, because for a while we love what we get out of it. We are infatuated with consuming, and then when the binge of that thing goes away, well, we will just go and we will binge the next thing. And at SMCC, as a pastor here, I actually see this happen all of the time, where someone will show up at SMCC, walk through the doors, and they are all in. I mean, if the doors are open, they're here, you're here, they don't miss a Sunday. And they might jump on a team, and they might jump into a group, and they might start serving, and maybe they even begin giving, and they are all in. And then out of nowhere, 2 months in or 6 months in, it all comes to a screeching halt. The binge is over, the season is over. No church, no groups. I never see him again until I see him at Smith's, and it's really awkward, It's like, hope he doesn't see me, And as a pastor, this breaks my heart. It literally keeps me up at night. That is not pastor hyperbole. It keeps me up at night as I wonder what happened. What could have been different? What could we have done as a church together, as a body? What could we have done so that this might have been a different story, that wasn't a binge, but it was this daily walk for a person? Now, by the way, if you are all in on Jesus right now and you're thinking, yeah, Eric, that's not me. You're describing someone who's not here today. My question for you is, how do you know that won't be you? How do you know that this season that you're in with Jesus, however long it's been, won't come to an end? And so today we begin a series about something very, very specific. It's about this change that needs to happen in every human heart. And I want to put it up on the screen. Today we begin a series where we move from a consumer mindset to a kingdom mindset. Now I just want to say this. Everybody begins as a consumer. If you're here today and you're like, that music was really good, I like consuming it, that's okay. I understand that. I love it too. If you're here because your kids have a great experience and it's, free goldfish crackers, consume, that's fine. But there is this point where we do need to take a next step and move from a consumer mindset to a kingdom mindset. Because living inside of a kingdom where a good God is king is way better than living as a consumer. And over the next 9 weeks or so, we want to show you that. So today we begin a series where we are going to study the first book in the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew. And we're going to follow with this one phrase that shows up over and over again in the Gospel of Matthew. It's one specific phrase that's going to structure the 9-week series. The phrase is this: the kingdom is like. The kingdom is like. So we're going to look at these phrases, the kingdom is like, and then what Jesus says after that as he teaches about what his kingdom is actually like. And along with this series, we have a resource for you. We have a devotional guide. If you're like, what's a devotional guide? It's a way for you to engage with this stuff and stay connected to this stuff beyond Sunday. We've been saying this: Jesus is bigger than Sunday. We want to equip you Monday through Friday in your head, your heart, and your hands. And so we've prepared a devotional guide that you can download and you can follow along in the series. There's 3 ways you could download it. I think we have a QR code on the screen. If you're digital, you can grab your phone out and snap a picture of that. Or you can go to the info booth in the lobby and buy a journal, and inside of it you can get a link to a digital copy of the devotional. Or you can go to our website, scroll down to small group leader resources, click on that, and you can download it there. And for the next 9 weeks, we're going to journey through the book of Matthew together, looking at what this kingdom is like. Now today, the message is sort of a setup to the kingdom, because before Jesus decides to tell us what the kingdom is like, he wants to prepare us for people who can hear what the kingdom is like, because not everybody's ready to hear that. And so today we're going to pick it up looking at what Jesus says needs to happen inside of people if they're going to be ready to embrace the kingdom. But before all of that, I want to give you an overview of what we mean by kingdom, and I want to start in Matthew chapter 4. In Matthew 4, Jesus begins his ministry with an incredible line. This is how he starts. There's a few things that happen in Matthew, but then he steps into leadership. He's going to lead. He begins to serve. He begins his ministry, and he says this: from that time on, Jesus began to preach, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." Another translation: the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of heaven is now. It's advancing among you. So as Jesus begins to lead, this is one of the first things he talks about. It's one of the last things that he talks about. In the Gospels, roughly 90 times Jesus talks about the kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven, the same kingdom, just changing that last part depending on the audience so the audience could hear it just a little bit better without distraction. John the Baptist talks about the kingdom. When Jesus sends out the disciples, he says, "Go and would you preach the kingdom?" So this idea of kingdom is all throughout the Gospels. And I want to give you a simple definition so you can begin to understand kingdom, because you don't live in a kingdom. And so it might be a little foreign to us. But if you're taking notes today, you could fill this in. The kingdom of God is any realm where God's will is done. Any realm where God's will is done. And I want to give you 4 R's to help you understand what we mean when we say kingdom. This isn't on the screen, but I want to give you just 4 R's. Every kingdom has a king or a ruler. A ruler. And every king can announce his decrees for his ruling, or he can announce his rules. So a ruler has rules. That's the second R, rule. So a ruler has a rule. This is how you should behave. This is how you should live. This is what's going to happen inside of my kingdom. The third one is a realm. A realm is the extent to which the king's rule travels. It's how far it goes. If it's an actual kingdom, there's geography. It's to this border and to this border. That's where the realm goes. So every kingdom has a ruler, the rules of the kingdom, a realm, and here's the last one, a reign. And a reign is what's describing the influence of the king over people who submit to his rule. And so where people are submitted to his rule, it can be said that the king is reigning over people. The king is on his throne, so to speak. Now that might sound even kind of a little strange to us, so let me give you a way to understand it that's really, really simple. I want to talk about the man cave for just a moment. I know some of you have a man cave. A man cave has all of these things. If you have a man cave, you are the ruler, right? And you get to say what happens inside of your man cave. That's your rule. All right, your man cave has a defined amount of space. That's where it goes. That's what happens there. That's your realm. And when people step into it, they better follow your reign. That's the man cave. And you know what? These gender, things. Have you heard of the she shed before? If you have a she shed, it's the same thing. I asked my friend Scott earlier, I said, hey, does Shauna have a she shed? He goes, it's the rest of the house. So this is kind of the same idea, man cave or the she shed, these gender stereotypes. I'm sorry, but you get the idea, right? In that place, there's a ruler, there's rules, it's a realm, and in that space, you reign. And this is the idea of a kingdom. So when we talk about God as king, what we're saying is he is the ruler. He has announced to us his rule, how we should live, how we should respond. We know that his leadership and authority extends across all of creation. And then wherever people are submitted to him, they're submitted to his reign. And let me just say this, God's dominion, realm, and reign, it is bigger than yours. Abraham Kuyper once said this, and I love it. He says, there's not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, well, that's mine. So God is the ruler. He has communicated his rule. He's designated the extent of his rule and his realm, and he is reigning. And salvation is the entry point. It is the open door into the kingdom. That's what it is. It's the open door into the kingdom. And wherever people are submitted to the king, he's reigning. And as people continue to submit to him, his kingdom advances. Because as they submit, they live out his kingdom values. They live according to the rule of the ruler. And wherever that's happening, wherever God's will is being done by people who are submitted to him because they know he is reigning, God's kingdom is advancing. Wherever his will is being done, we are living in his realm. And this is incredibly important for us. And so there is a now aspect of this because the kingdom is advancing as we live inside of it here and now. But there's a not yet aspect of this as God will reign physically in the future. But in the meantime, as more and more people submit to the goodness of God, the kingdom advances and it leads to human flourishing for all people. And I get it, hearing someone talk about a kingdom, you might think, I don't know if I'm in on this. I don't know if this is for me yet. You might be thinking that, but we all value a certain type of culture. We all want the world to be a certain type of way. And I'm convinced God's way is the best way for everybody. And this is why we talk about the kingdom advancing. And this is why we are doing this series. This series is about that type of kingdom. And it's a kingdom that includes each of us. We can decide to be a part of it. We can step into that kingdom as we step under the rule of the king. And so that's what this series is about. But before Jesus announces what the kingdom is like in Matthew 13, he talks about the type of person who's prepared for the type of teaching about the kingdom. So we're gonna begin with that so that we can get our heart posture correct, so that we can then receive in the weeks to come what Jesus says about the kingdom. And so one day the crowds were massive. They had heard about Jesus. They had heard about what he had done. They had heard about his healings, his miracles, the way he was feeding people. And so they showed up, to use the words of today's message, to binge on Jesus, okay? They wanted more of him. So they showed up thinking, I'm gonna consume, and this new rabbi on the scene, I wonder if I can gain something from him. And Jesus knew this. He wasn't surprised by this. And so he begins to teach, and he tells a story about 4 different types of people, because he needed to adjust their expectation. He wasn't going to allow them just to show up and consume. He wanted them to move to a kingdom mindset. So he talks about 4 different responses that exist to all that he is about to say. And he's gonna teach this so that people can then reflect and say, well, what type of person do I wanna be? And so this all goes down in Matthew chapter 13, and that's where we're gonna be today as we study this intro to Jesus' teaching on what the kingdom is like. So Matthew 13, picking it up in verse 1. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and he sat in it while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables. I want to pause right there for a moment and talk about what a parable is. Jesus taught in the existing style of the rabbis of the day. He taught with hyperbole, which is to exaggerate a point, to make your point stick, and he taught in parables. Parables are very, very important, and they're often misunderstood. Parable comes from 2 Greek words put together, the word para, which means alongside, like parallel, and the word balo, which means to throw. So a parable is a truth thrown alongside everyday life. And so Jesus taught in parables. And parables have one meaning, one truth built into a parable. And we get into dangerous ground when we try to say every aspect of the parable, every little piece represents something else. That moves from parable to allegory. And when you move into allegory, it's a dangerous approach to interpreting the Bible. So we have to stay within the confines of what a parable actually is. So a parable is a truth thrown alongside everyday life. And here Jesus begins to tell a story or a parable that's one of his most famous. It's the parable of the soils. Perhaps you've heard this parable before. It's incredibly famous, and it's what is communicated next. So Matthew chapter 13, picking it up in the second half of verse 3, Jesus told them this parable. A farmer went out to sow his seed, and as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up, and some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop, 160 or 30 times what was sown. That's an incredible crop. That's an incredible return. If you got, 100 times back what you put in, you'd be pretty happy, That's an incredible return on the investment. And then Jesus says, whoever has ears, let him hear, which is a clue to what this parable is about. It's about a person who can hear. It's about a person who's unwilling, a person who might be unwilling to hear. So just so that we're so on the same page today, I brought some soils with me to help it all sink in, if you don't mind. 4 types of soils. So Jesus begins by talking about the first soil, which is this soil. No soil at all. It's the rocky path. So he talks about a farmer throwing seed. It hits the rocky path. It has nothing to stick to. It cannot find its way into the soil at all. And so the seed just simply sits there. It just sits there. It doesn't set in. It doesn't sink in. And so what happens is birds come along and they eat the seed. It doesn't stick. It's actually taken away. That's the first type of soil. It's the soil of the path. And then the second soil is the rocky soil. And I went out back to Draper's Fine Gravel parking lot and I picked up, actually Trevor did that for me, but I picked this up. And so the idea here is that inside of very rocky soil, the ground underneath can be very warm. And so it produces a quick growing environment where things spring up quickly, but roots don't go down deeply. And so that becomes a problem because when the hot Middle Eastern sun comes, it scorches the plant. And if you're a gardener, if you're an agricultural person, you get this. This makes sense. This is like my backyard in Saratoga Springs, okay? It's very, very challenging. All right, it's not fertile soil. It's rocky. And then Jesus describes a different type of soil, the weedy soil. And here the thing can grow for a while, but what happens is that the weeds can choke out the thing that's growing. There's other things involved that steal the water and steal the sunlight and prevent healthy growth. The thing is growing. The seed has produced life, but that life is choked out because of the things that surround the plant itself. And then, of course, Jesus talks about good soil. And what happens in good soil is the seed can set in and there's nourishment from the good soil and the roots can go deep and then the plant can be healthy. So that's the parable, that's the illustration, and Jesus is throwing some type of truth, which we haven't gotten to yet, alongside a metaphor that an agricultural community would have absolutely understood. So Jesus sets up the story like this. If you have ears, you should hear. Now, the crowd is a bit confused. I mean, you can imagine, the eyes glaze over. They're not sure where he's going with this illustration. So the disciples come to him and they're like, Jesus, can you help us out? We need just a little bit more clarity when it comes to these four soils. And so Matthew 13 continues on, and Jesus talks about why he teaches in parables. We'll pick it up in verse 10. The disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? Why do you speak to us in parables? And he replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And then he goes on to reference Isaiah, an Old Testament passage that really supports what he's saying here in this New Testament passage. So Jesus isn't talking, though, in this moment about having more blessing. He's not talking about having more money. He's talking about the type of person who's able to embrace more insight, more wisdom, to understand truth and how that truth applies to all reality, how that truth is reality. And so Jesus teaches in parables to do two things. It's pretty simple: to conceal and reveal. To conceal and reveal. And Jesus isn't purposely trying to keep people away from truth. He just knows that there are people that don't want to embrace that type of truth. He's saying there are people who are desperate and hungry for truth, who want it. And he's saying there's another group of people who don't want it. And a parable allows somebody to engage at a certain depth in which they are willing and ready to understand truth. So parables reveal and conceal. He's not trying to keep people in the dark, but he knows that there are people who want to keep themselves in the dark. And parables are a communication tool to help people engage with a willingness and readiness that they have to the announcements of the King. So this is why Jesus teaches in parables. Now, this is really, really important. What he's beginning to describe is the type of person who can respond to truth. So Jesus goes back to the story. The disciples, they want more clarity, and so he goes back to the story and he breaks it down for them and for us in verse 18. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. Sometimes Jesus explains his parable, sometimes he just lets them hang. In this one, he explains it, which is super helpful for us. He says, this is what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. So the seed that falls on the road, the hard path, that represents God's truth being placed inside of someone's life. But that truth doesn't sink in deep, and the truth sort of just goes away. The evil one snatches it away, which is a pretty pointed way of saying, look, you're going to believe something else. And if you're not going to embrace truth, you're probably going to wind up embracing a lie. So Jesus says that's the first soil. It's the path. And then he says this, picking it up in verse 20, the seed falling on the rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy, but since they have no root, they last only a short time. And when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. So he's saying in the rocky soil, there's going to be some fast growth, but there's just not enough depth. And so as the plant grows but gets scorched by the sun because the roots don't go deep, so a person can be when they embrace God's truth for a season, but then experience circumstances in their world that are so confusing and so difficult that they decide this can't be true anymore. This is not for me. And so they spring up for a season, but then they stop in their pursuit of Jesus. Verse 22, the seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. So the plant grows up, but there are other things inside of this person's life, and it chokes out the fruit that could have grown when the plant was healthy. So that's the third soil. And then Jesus explains what good soil is. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. And so when he got done explaining this, I imagine the disciples begin to look around like, who's he talking about, boys? Who's he have in mind? They'd probably stare up into the blue Middle Eastern sky. They look down at the sand on the seashore, trying not to make eye contact because it's probably all just a little bit too tense. But all this is designed to bring those people and us to just one question. The question this parable is designed to produce inside of every one of us today is this question on the screen. Well, which soil am I? Which soil am I? The parable was designed to engage people's emotions. It was designed to engage their minds with something very practical and very tangible in life. And Jesus tells the story. He brings them to the edge of it, and he leaves them with a question. He doesn't need to ask the question because the tension in the story produces the question itself. And that question is, well, which soil am I? And this is the question for us today. So the seed that's sown represents God's truth. And the four different types of soil represent four different responses that people 2,000 years ago had, that people today have to God's truth. So which soil are you? And some of you know exactly where you are right now. And some of you have been all four soils at one point in your life. And you sort of go back and forth, depending on the week, depending on the month. And just so that this can sink in, and just so you can begin to engage the question, I just want to describe these four soils as four types of people so that you can begin to engage with the soils and begin to identify which soil you might be in this season of your life. And so the seed falling on the path really represents a resistant person. The resistant person. This person has some doubt, but it's not the type of doubt that's looking for resolution. It's the type of doubt that's comfortable staying as they are. Because they're not looking for a resolution. And maybe it was religion that produced this resistance and produced the hard soil or the hard heart. Perhaps it was irreligion that did the same. But this is a person who says, I am not open to new information, even if that information were true. I'm not open to it because I'm very comfortable with my life the way it is. So this is the person whose eyes aren't open to see, whose ears aren't open to hear. This is the person who resists the truth. And there might be times that truth shows up, but it doesn't stick because they're a resistant person. The seed falling on the rocky soil represents the impulsive person. And this is the category of our binger. It's the impulsive person. It's the binger. This is the person who engages really quickly, really rapidly, tries to do all things all at once. and they shoot up for a season and they're all in and they got the bumper sticker and they change their Instagram thing, to say something about following Jesus, and they are all in for a season. They spring up very quickly, hyperactivity with Christianity for a moment. But then here's what happens. The difficulties, and we saw it in the text, the difficulties of the world, circumstances don't go the way they thought it would go, and they say, God must not be with me, or God cannot be real, because if he was, he wouldn't allow me to go through this. And the heat of the trials of life burn them down. And what happens in these seasons, and I've seen it so often, is that what people said yes to wasn't actually the gospel to begin with. They said yes to some form of therapy from God. They said yes to some type of, relief from God. They said yes to what they could get from him. They didn't say yes to him because of who he is. And so in that sense, the roots just don't go down deep enough because they said yes to the wrong thing. And what they said yes to was something they were consuming. They weren't saying yes to the king himself. And so they sprang up for a while, but something came along and scorched their life with God because they said yes to the wrong thing. And then there's the third person. The seed falling in the weeds represents a torn person. The person who's torn. It's not that Jesus isn't important. It's not that Jesus isn't a part of their lives. It's that he's not the most important part of their lives. They're torn. They got Jesus over here. They got their career right here. They got their kids' sports career right here. They got their 401k over here. They got all of that. And Jesus is a part of that. But he is being choked out by all the other things that are perhaps more important. And so in that situation, the fruit couldn't grow. It couldn't produce this return of 160-30 because there were too many things going on that would choke out a healthy and flourishing relationship with God. So that represents the torn person. And here's the last one. The seed falling on good soil represents the growing person. The growing person. They were receptive to God's truth and they acted on it. They were receptive to his truth, and they acted on it, and this produced fruit in their lives. They knew that following Jesus was not a fleeting binge. They knew that it was a daily walk. And so they decided to till the soil of their lives so that God's truth could take root. There's a lot of ways that we till the soil of our lives. I'll talk about a few of those in just a little bit. The way we grow is not by trying harder, it's by seeing better. And someone who is good soil, someone who's growing, has put themselves into places, they've taken steps so they can see Jesus for who he is. When you see Jesus for who he is, you will realize your circumstances are not a test of his goodness. The ultimate test of his goodness is all that he's already done in the finished work on the cross. When you see Jesus for who he is, you'll see that his commands are actually in your best interest, and obedience leads to your joy in life. And when you see Jesus for who he is, you will see that spiritual disciplines are all a way to till up the soil in your life so that you can see him better. And when you take next steps of obedience, they're all next steps to see him better. And so we see him better when we put ourselves in environments where the soil gets tilled up. Sunday morning is one of those environments. This is why you need to be here, because this cultivates the soil. When you read your Bible, it cultivates the soil so this truth can set in. When you are in relationship with other people who are taking their next steps to know Jesus, it's part of tilling up the soil so you can see him better. And spiritual disciplines, they're all a way to remove the things that might make it so we can't see him, so that we actually can see him clearer. And to stay in the metaphor, this is the type of thing that tills up the soil so that God's truth can take root, so that we can grow, where roots go deep so that we can bear fruit. This is what Jesus is talking about in this parable. So, 4 applications for 4 different types of people based on this parable. If you would say, Eric, yeah, let's just be honest, bro. This is me right here. This is me. There's just not much going on. I just want to say this. Would you continue to investigate? Would you continue to evaluate how you think? Because truth, it needs to matter. We need answers to life's biggest questions. And if you're like, I don't need an answer, well, that's an answer to life's biggest questions. It's no answer, actually. So if this is you, my invitation to you is simply come back next week or shoot somebody an email and ask for a recommendation to see if there's evidence that would support who Jesus is. Keep investigating so that you can see Jesus clearly. If this is you right here, rocky soil, if you would say, you know what, Eric, to be honest, I feel like I might be in the middle of one of those binges you were talking about. Like I'm all in on Jesus right now, but it's just like 60 miles an hour and I'm not sure it's a daily walk. I'm sprinting and you know what, I'm a bit overwhelmed because I'm trying to do all spiritual things all at once. Take a breath and take just one next step. Sometimes people try to take every next step all at once. And it's a bit overwhelming. And it's really, really exhausting. And when you try to take every next step all at once, it puts so much pressure on your life, on the roots that really aren't that deep to begin with. And it can come and it can go and it can be a binge. And you might be the person I see at Smith's and I'm like, I haven't seen you in a while. And you're like, yeah, I know. So one next step you might want to take. There's a number of them you could take. But if you're following Jesus, and you haven't been baptized, that's a really important next step. Because it's the next step where you can publicly identify as a Jesus follower. You can go public with your faith. And that commitment, it can be so meaningful on a personal level. There's other next steps, that might just be one. Perhaps you're thinking, you know, Eric, Jesus is important, but there's a lot of other things that are important as well. And he kind of gets my leftovers and he gets a little bit of time on Sunday, but there's a lot of other things that begin to choke him out. And if that's you, there's a lot of wonderful next steps. There's classes that you could take, SMCCU to help you see him better. There's groups that you could jump in. There's teams that you could join. But I want to give you two next steps. One that comes right out of the text and one that's an application of the text. One of the things that Jesus talks about choking out a healthy, growing relationship with him is wealth. That's what he brought up. And we know that that's the case, that our financial picture can produce a lot of worry, a lot of anxiety in our lives. And the remedy to some of that, it sounds so counterintuitive, is actually to give some of that away. You're like, but Eric, wouldn't I have less money for me? Yeah, but your heart would have more room to grow. Because when you give, when you're generous, you're saying this thing, it can't choke out my relationship with God anymore. Generosity matters. When you give here, when you give anywhere, it doesn't have to be here, give somewhere else. But you become a person who says this thing for me isn't gonna be something that looms over me. I'm gonna tell my money where it goes. I'm not a slave to it. It works for me now. And there can be peace in that. But let me give you one other way you can begin to remove the things that might choke out Jesus. And this might sound a little bit strange, but I want to talk just for a moment about fasting. You're like, I don't know, we're one of those churches. Fasting. When you go without something, you tell that thing, you don't get to choke out this part of my life anymore. When you go without and you cut it out, it can't choke out your relationship with God. And so whatever that thing might be, when you say, I'm gonna go without that thing, you remove it from the picture so that you can see Jesus more clearly. This is all about helping you see better. If it's been a long time since you've done some fasting, maybe this is your way of saying that thing is not the main thing anymore, Jesus is. I'm gonna push it to the side on purpose for a season so that I can see how great Jesus is. But one application for the people here. Good soil. Just want to say you're so encouraging to me. You're so encouraging to so many people. You understand that walking with Jesus is a daily thing and you've been walking for a long time and you've been supporting a body here for a long time. so that others can perhaps take their next steps from this soil, or this soil to this soil. I just want to say thank you for doing that. Thank you for walking daily with Jesus and walking daily with others so that they can walk with him too. You're good soil, and it's producing good fruit, and it is building the kingdom here. What a privilege that we get to do that together. So Jesus tells this initial parable to set us up for all his teachings about what the kingdom is like over the next few weeks. We're going to look at them. But it'll be hard to embrace those if we're here, or here. Because to embrace those, we need to be here. People who are receptive to his truth. People who trust that the announcements of the king, the decrees of the king, the rules of the ruler are in everyone's best interests. So come back next week and till up some soil this week so that we can continue on to hear what the kingdom is like, the kingdom of our king. Here's the bottom line of today's message. Don't binge on Christianity, but rather build the kingdom with the king. Don't binge, but build. Whichever soil you are, I hope you can take a next step to see that following Jesus is not one season of hyperactivity, but it's a daily walk for the rest of our lives. It's not a binge, it's a build. We get to build the kingdom with the king. And we're going to talk about what that kingdom is like next week. I hope you are here for that. But today we just get to ask the question, which soil am I? And we get to be people who respond to the announcement of the king, that the kingdom's at hand, and we can be a part of it. We can ask God to help till up the soil of our lives so that we would be receptive to it. Let's not binge. Let's build. Would you pray with me? Jesus, what a wonderful story you told that has lasted and impacted people all across the globe for centuries. So here we are looking at the story again. And Jesus, we want to respond by giving you permission to make us good soil, which should come out of the parable means, Jesus, help us be people who see the beauty, the value, the worth of your truth so that we could say yes to it and join you as we build the kingdom with you, that we would recognize that it is at hand and that we can be people, men and women, who say yes to living your way, living out your kingdom values here and now, knowing that it is good for the whole world, knowing that it is good for Draper, Utah, knowing that that is good in our own lives. So I pray as we embark on this journey through Matthew to learn what your kingdom is like, that we would just be happy to do so. It's good soil. And that as we do this together, Jesus, there would be a harvest of lives changed, of fruitful living, of human flourishing, far beyond what we might have ever expected through us as the kingdom comes. Jesus, be with us for the next 9 weeks as we take off on this study together and build the kingdom here. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's message and trusting us with your time. If you'd like to connect with one of our pastors or staff, you can easily do that by visiting smccutah.org/connect. When you fill out that quick form, they will get back to you within a few days and be able to connect with you. As well, if you'd like to know more about taking a next step at SMCC, you can easily look at what next steps we have by visiting smccutah.org/nextsteps. And lastly, if you found today's message both hopeful and helpful, I would encourage you to do maybe one of two things. First, you can share this message with someone that would find it helpful. And you can also choose to partner with us financially so that more people can see messages like this. You can find more information on what that looks like by visiting smccutah.org/give. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you at one of our locations soon.